Part II. Combray. 14. And so was wafted to my ears the name of Gilberte, bestowed on me like a talisman, which might, perhaps, enable me some day to rediscover her whom its syllables had just endowed with a definite personality, whereas a moment earlier she had been only something vaguely seen. So it came to me, uttered across the heads of the stocks and jasmines, pungent and cool as the drops which fell from the green watering pipe, impregnating and irradiating the zone of pure air through which it had passed, which it set apart and isolated from all other air, with the mystery of the life of her whom its syllables designated to the happy creatures that lived and walked and traveled in her company, unfolding through the arch of the pink hawthorn which opened at the height of my shoulder the quintessence of their familiarity, so exquisitely painful to myself, with her, and with all that unknown world of her existence into which I should never penetrate. For a moment, while we moved away, and my grandfather murmured, "Poor Swann, what a life they are leading him! Fancy sending him away so that she can be left alone with her Charlot," for that was Charlot, I recognized him at once. And the child, too, at her age, to be mixed up in all that. The impression left on me by the despotic tone in which Gilberte's mother had spoken to her, without her replying, by exhibiting her to me as being obliged to yield obedience to some one else, as not being indeed superior to the whole world, calmed my sufferings somewhat, revived some hope in me, and cooled the ardor of my love. But very soon that love surged up again in me like a reaction, by which my humiliated heart was endeavoring to rise to Gilberte's level, or to draw her down to its own. I loved her. I was sorry not to have had the time and the inspiration to insult her, to do her some injury, to force her to keep some memory of me. I knew her to be so beautiful that I should have liked to be able to retrace my steps, so as to shake my fist at her and shout, "I think you are hideous, grotesque. You are utterly disgusting." However, I walked away, carrying with me then and forever afterwards, as the first illustration of a type of happiness rendered inaccessible to a little boy of my kind by certain laws of nature which it was impossible to transgress, the picture of a little girl with reddish hair, and a skin freckled with tiny pink marks, who held a trowel in her hand, and smiled as she directed towards me a long and subtle and inexpressive stare. And already the charm with which her name, like a cloud of incense, had filled that archway in the pink hawthorn through which she and I had together heard its sound, was beginning to conquer, to cover, to embalm, to beautify everything with which it had any association, her grandparents, whom my own had been so unspeakably fortunate as to know, the glorious profession of a stockholder, even the melancholy neighborhood of the Champs Elysees, where she lived in Paris. "Léonie," said my grandfather on our return, "I wish we had had you with us this afternoon. You would never have known Tansonville. If I had had the courage, I would have cut you a branch of that pink hawthorn you used to like so much." And so my grandfather told her the story of our walk, either just to amuse her, or perhaps because there was still some hope that she might be stimulated to rise from her bed and to go out of doors. For in earlier days she had been very fond of Tansonville, and moreover Swann's visits had been the last that she had continued to receive at a time when she had already closed her doors to all the world. And just as, when he called in these later days to inquire for her, and she was still the only person in our household whom he would ask to see, she would send down to say that she was tired at the moment and resting, but that she would be happy to see him another time. So this evening she said to my grandfather, "Yes, some day when the weather is fine, I shall go for a drive as far as the gate of the park." And in saying this she was quite sincere. She would have liked to see Swann and Tansonville again. But the mere wish to do so sufficed for all that remained of her strength, which its fulfillment would have more than exhausted. Sometimes a spell of fine weather made her a little more energetic. She would rise and put on her clothes. But before she had reached the outer room she would be tired again, and would insist on returning to her bed. The process which had begun in her, and in her a little earlier only than it must come to all of us, was the great and general renunciation which old age makes in preparation for death, the chrysalis stage of life, which may be observed wherever life has been unduly prolonged. Even in old lovers who have lived for one another with the utmost intensity of passion, and in old friends bound by the closest ties of mental sympathy, who after a certain year cease to make the necessary journey, or even to cross the street to see one another, cease to correspond, and know well that they will communicate no more in this world. My aunt must have been perfectly well aware that she would not see Swann again, that she would never leave her own house any more, but this ultimate seclusion seemed to be accepted by her with all the more readiness for the very reason which, to our minds, ought to have made it more unbearable, namely, that such a seclusion was forced upon her by the gradual and steady diminution in her strength which she was able to measure daily, which, by making every action, every movement tiring to her, if not actually painful, gave to inaction, isolation, and silence the blessed, strengthening, and refreshing charm of repose. My aunt did not go to see the pink hawthorn in the hedge, but at all hours of the day I would ask the rest of my family whether she was not going to go, whether she used not at one time to go often to Tansonville, trying to make them speak of Mademoiselle Swann's parents and grandparents, who appeared to me to be as great and glorious as gods. The name, which had for me become almost mythological, of Swann, when I talked with my family I would grow sick with longing to hear them utter it. I dared not pronounce it myself, but I would draw them into a discussion of matters which led naturally to Gilberte and her family, in which she was involved, in speaking of which I would feel myself not too remotely banished from her company. And I would suddenly force my father, by pretending, for instance, to believe that my grandfather's business had been in our family before his day, or that the hedge with the pink hawthorn, which my aunt Léonie wished to visit, was on common ground, to correct my statements, to say, as though in opposition to me and of his own accord, "No, no, the business belonged to Swann's father. That hedge is part of Swann's park." And then I would be obliged to pause for breath, so stifling was the pressure upon that part of me where it was forever inscribed, of that name which, at the moment when I heard it, seemed to me fuller, more portentous than any other name, because it was burdened with the weight of all the occasions on which I had secretly uttered it in my mind. It caused me a pleasure which I was ashamed to have dared to demand from my parents, for so great was it that to have procured it for me must have involved them in an immensity of effort, and with no recompense, since for them there was no pleasure in the sound. And so I would prudently turn the conversation. And by a scruple of conscience also. All the singular seductions which I had stored up in the sound of that word "Swann" I found again as soon as it was uttered. And then it occurred to me suddenly that my parents could not fail to experience the same emotions, that they must find themselves sharing my point of view, that they perceived in their turn, that they condoned, that they even embraced my visionary longings, and I was as wretched as though I had ravished and corrupted the innocence of their hearts. That year my family fixed the day of their return to Paris rather earlier than usual. On the morning of our departure I had had my hair curled, to be ready to face the photographer, had had a new hat carefully set upon my head, and had been buttoned into a velvet jacket. A little later my mother, after searching everywhere for me, found me standing in tears on that steep little hillside close to Tansonville, bidding a long farewell to my hawthorns, clasping their sharp branches to my bosom, and, like a princess in a tragedy, oppressed by the weight of all her senseless jewelry, with no gratitude towards the officious hand which had, in curling those ringlets, been at pains to collect all my hair upon my forehead, trampling underfoot the curl papers which I had torn from my head and my new hat with them. My mother was not at all moved by my tears, but she could not suppress a cry at the sight of my battered headgear and my ruined jacket. I did not, however, hear her. "Oh, my poor little hawthorns," I was assuring them through my sobs, "it is not you that want to make me unhappy, to force me to leave you. You have never done me any harm, so I shall always love you." And drying my eyes, I promised them that when I grew up I would never copy the foolish example of other men, but that even in Paris, on fine spring days, instead of paying calls and listening to silly talk, I would make excursions into the country to see the first hawthorn trees in bloom. Once in the fields, we never left them again during the rest of our Méséglise walk. They were perpetually crossed, as though by invisible streams of traffic, by the wind, which was to me the tutelary genius of Combray. Every year, on the day of our arrival, in order to feel that I really was at Combray, I would climb the hill to find it running again through my clothing and setting me running in its wake. One always had the wind for companion when one went the Méséglise way, on that swelling plain which stretched mile beyond mile without any disturbance of its gentle contour. I knew that Mademoiselle Swann used often to go and spend a few days at Laon, and for all that it was many miles away, the distance was obviated by the absence of any intervening obstacle. When, on hot afternoons, I would see a breath of wind emerge from the farthest horizon, bowing the heads of the corn in distant fields, pouring like a flood over all that vast expanse, and finally settling down, warm and rustling, among the clover and sainfoin at my feet, that plain which was common to us both seemed then to draw us together, to unite us. I would imagine that the same breath had passed by her also, that there was some message from her in what it was whispering to me, without my being able to understand it, and I would catch and kiss it as it passed. On my left was a village called Champeaux, Campus Pagani, according to the curé. On my right I could see across the cornfields the two crocketed, rustic spires of Saint André des Champs, themselves as tapering, scaly, plated, honeycombed, yellowed, and roughened as two ears of wheat. At regular intervals, among the inimitable ornamentation of their leaves, which can be mistaken for those of no other fruit tree, the apple trees were exposing their broad petals of white satin, or hanging in shy bunches their unopened blushing buds. It was while going the Méséglise way that I first noticed the circular shadow which apple trees cast upon the sunlit ground, and also those impalpable threads of golden silk which the setting sun weaves slantingly downwards from beneath their leaves, and which I would see my father slash through with his stick without ever making them swerve from their straight path. Sometimes in the afternoon sky a white moon would creep up, like a little cloud, furtive, without display, suggesting an actress who does not have to come on for a while, and so goes in front in her ordinary clothes to watch the rest of the company for a moment, but keeps in the background, not wishing to attract attention to herself. I was glad to find her image reproduced in books and paintings, though these works of art were very different, at least in my earlier years, before Bloch had attuned my eyes and mind to more subtle harmonies, from those in which the moon seems fair to me today, but in which I should not have recognized her then. It might be, for instance, some novel by Saintine, some landscape by Gleyre, in which she is cut out sharply against the sky in the form of a silver sickle, some work as unsophisticated and as incomplete as were, at that date, my own impressions, and which it enraged my grandmother's sisters to see me admire. They held that one ought to set before children, and that children showed their own innate good taste in admiring, only such books and pictures as they would continue to admire when their minds were developed and mature. No doubt they regarded aesthetic values as material objects which an unclouded vision could not fail to discern, without needing to have their equivalent in experience of life stored up and slowly ripening in one's heart. It was along the Méséglise way, at Montjouvain, a house built on the edge of a large pond, and overlooked by a steep shrub-grown hill, that Monsieur Von Toye lived. And so we used often to meet his daughter driving her dog-cart at full speed along the road. After a certain year we never saw her alone, but always accompanied by a friend, a girl older than herself, with an evil reputation in the neighborhood, who in the end installed herself permanently one day at Montjouvain. People said, "That poor Monsieur Von Toye must be blinded by love, not to see what every one is talking about, and to let his daughter, a man who is horrified if you use a word in the wrong sense, bring a woman like that to live under his roof. He says that she is a most superior woman, with a heart of gold, and that she would have shown extraordinary musical talent if she had only been trained. He may be sure it is not music that she is teaching his daughter." but M. von Toyer assured them that it was, and indeed it is remarkable that people never fail to arouse admiration of their normal qualities in the relatives of any one with whom they are in physical intercourse. Bodily passion, which has been so unjustly decried, compels its victims to display every vestige that is in them of unselfishness and generosity, and so effectively that they shine resplendent in the eyes of all beholders. Dr. Percipede, whose loud voice and bushy eyebrows enabled him to play to his heart's content the part of double dealer, a part to which he was not otherwise adapted, without in the least degree compromising his unassailable and quite unmerited reputation of being a kind-hearted old curmudgeon, could make the curé and every one else laugh until they cried by saying in a harsh voice, "What do you say to this now? It seems that she plays music with her friend, Mademoiselle Von Toyer. That surprises you, does it? Oh, I know nothing, nothing at all. It was Papa Von Toyer who told me all about it yesterday. After all, she has every right to be fond of music, that girl. I should never dream of thwarting the artistic vocation of a child, nor Von Toyer either, it seems. And then he plays music, too, with his daughter's friend. Why, gracious heavens, it must be a regular musical box, that house out there. What are you laughing at? I say they've been playing too much music, those people. I met Papa Von Toyer the other day by the cemetery. It was all he could do to keep on his feet." Any one who, like ourselves, had seen M. Von Toyer about this time, avoiding people whom he knew, and turning away as soon as he caught sight of them, changed in a few months into an old man, engulfed in a sea of sorrows, incapable of any effort not directly aimed at promoting his daughter's happiness, spending whole days beside his wife's grave, could hardly have failed to realize that he was gradually dying of a broken heart, could hardly have supposed that he paid no attention to the rumors which were going about. He knew, perhaps he even believed, what his neighbors were saying. There is probably no one, however rigid his virtue, who is not liable to find himself, by the complexity of circumstances, living at close quarters with the very vice which he himself has been most outspoken in condemning, without at first recognizing it beneath the disguise which it assumes on entering his presence, so as to wound him and to make him suffer. The odd words, the unaccountable attitude, one evening, of a person whom he has 1,000 reasons for loving. But for a man of M. Von Toyer's sensibility, it must have been far more painful than for a hardened man of the world to have to resign himself to one of those situations which are wrongly supposed to occur in Bohemian circles only, for they are produced whenever there needs to establish itself in the security necessary to its development a vice which nature herself has planted in the soul of a child, perhaps by no more than blending the virtues of its father and mother as she might blend the colors of their eyes. And yet, however much M. Von Toyer may have known of his daughter's conduct, it did not follow that his adoration of her grew any less. The facts of life do not penetrate to the sphere in which our beliefs are cherished. As it was not they that engendered those beliefs, so they are powerless to destroy them. They can aim at them continual blows of contradiction and disproof without weakening them, and an avalanche of miseries and maladies coming, one after another, without interruption into the bosom of a family, will not make it lose faith in either the clemency of its God or the capacity of its physician. But when M. Von Toyer regarded his daughter and himself from the point of view of the world and of their reputation, when he attempted to place himself by her side in the rank which they occupied in the general estimation of their neighbors, then he was bound to give judgment, to utter his own and her social condemnation in precisely the terms which the inhabitant of Combray most hostile to him and his daughter would have employed. He saw himself and her in low, in the very lowest water, inextricably stranded, and his manners had of late been tinged with that humility, that respect for persons who ranked above him, and to whom he must now look up, however far beneath him they might hitherto have been, that tendency to search for some means of rising again to their level, which is an almost mechanical result of any human misfortune. End of Part 2, Section 14,